My dear brothers and sisters, we live in a world where questions are celebrated, where everything demands an explanation, and where silence often feels uncomfortable. From a very young age, we are taught to ask, to challenge, to probe, and to demand answers. And while questioning can be a path to knowledge, there are moments, very critical moments, where asking the wrong question can weaken the heart rather than strengthen it. Allah, the most wise, the all-knowing, created us with intellect, but He also placed boundaries around it out of mercy, not because He wants to deprive us, but because He knows what we cannot bear. Sometimes the greatest protection Allah gives you is not an answer, but silence. Not every door is meant to be opened, and not every question is meant to be asked. There are questions that do not bring you closer to Allah. There are questions that plant doubt instead of certainty. There are questions that distract you from obedience and replace action with argument. And Allah, out of His love for you, wants you to stay away from them, not because He fears your curiosity, but because He values your faith. Today, we remind ourselves that submission is not blindness, it is trust. It is knowing that Allah sees what we cannot see, knows what we do not know, and withholds only what would harm us. When the heart learns this, it finds peace not in knowing everything, but in knowing who is in control. So let us prepare our hearts, quiet our egos, and listen carefully. Because the most powerful transformation begins when we learn not just what to ask, but what to leave with Allah. There are questions that do not bring you closer to Allah and understand. This single truth can completely change the way we approach our faith. Many people assume that every question is a sign of intelligence or sincerity. But in reality, the value of a question lies in where it leads the heart. If a question increases humility, obedience, and reliance on Allah, it is a blessing. But if it fuels arrogance, doubt, argumentation, or distraction from action, then it quietly becomes a burden on the soul. Allah did not create us to know everything, He created us to worship Him. This is a fundamental reality that we often forget. When the mind becomes obsessed with questions that have no impact on how we pray, how we treat people, how we control our desires, or how we seek forgiveness, then knowledge turns into noise. A person can spend years debating matters that will never be asked about on the Day of Judgment, while neglecting the obligations that are clearly commanded. This is why some questions, although they sound deep, actually pull the heart away from Allah rather than toward Him. One of the greatest dangers of such questions is that they replace submission with negotiation. Instead of saying, Allah knows best, the heart begins to say, but why? Again and again, not out of a desire to obey better, but out of resistance. Over time, this mindset weakens faith. A person may not even realize it, but the sweetness of worship begins to fade, feels heavy, and acts of obedience feel mechanical. The problem is not Islam, nor is it Allah's guidance. The problem is a heart that is being trained to argue rather than surrender. We must remember that even the Shaytaan asked questions. His downfall did not come from ignorance, but from questioning Allah's command with arrogance. Why should I? Was the question that destroyed him. In contrast, the angels asked questions out of humility and a desire to understand Allah's wisdom. And when Allah informed them, they submitted immediately. The difference was not the question itself, but the state of the heart behind it. This is why Allah wants to protect us from questions that are rooted in ego rather than sincerity. Another harm of unnecessary questioning is that it creates confusion where clarity already exists. Allah has made the path of guidance clear. Believe, pray, give charity, be honest, lower your gaze, control your tongue, seek forgiveness, and treat others with mercy. These are not complicated commands. But when a person becomes overly focused on speculative questions, beyond human reach, they begin to feel that faith itself is complicated. This confusion is not from Allah. It is from stepping outside the boundaries of what benefits us. There is also a spiritual exhaustion that comes with chasing answers Allah has chosen not to reveal. The human mind is limited, and when it tries to grasp the infinite, it becomes overwhelmed. Instead of finding peace, the heart becomes restless. Islam was never meant to be a source of anxiety. Allah wants ease for us, not hardship. When He withholds certain knowledge, it is not a punishment, it is mercy. Accepting this brings tranquility, while resisting it brings inner turmoil. True strength of faith is not shown by how many questions one can ask, but by how firmly one can trust Allah without answers. This trust transforms the believer. When hardship strikes, such a person does not spiral into endless why questions. Instead, they say, Allah chose this for me and He is wise. This does not mean the pain disappears, but it gives the pain meaning. It anchors the heart. When we understand that some questions pull us away from Allah, we become more intentional. We begin to ask ourselves before speaking or thinking, will this question increase my obedience? Will it soften my heart? Will it bring me closer to Allah? If the answer is no, then silence becomes an act of worship. Restraint becomes wisdom. And faith becomes lighter, purer, and more sincere. In the end, Allah does not want to deprive us of knowledge. He wants to protect our hearts. And the believer who understands this walks the path of Islam not burdened by endless doubts, but supported by trust, humility, and peace. Understanding that not every question benefits our faith is a lesson that requires deep reflection, because we live in a time where questioning everything is often praised without distinction. People are encouraged to challenge every idea, every belief, and every authority, assuming that this will automatically lead to enlightenment. But faith is not the same as philosophy, and the heart is not the same as the intellect. What strengthens the mind does not always strengthen the soul, and Allah, in His perfect wisdom, knows exactly what nurtures faith and what slowly erodes it. There are questions that refine Iman, and there are questions that slowly chip away at it. The believer must learn to tell the difference. A beneficial question is one that leads to action. How can I pray better? How can I purify my heart? How can I become more sincere? How can I avoid sin? How can I please Allah more? These questions bring growth, humility, and closeness to Allah. But there are other questions that remain suspended in theory, disconnected from action, and often rooted in comparison, speculation, or dissatisfaction. These questions rarely change behavior, but they quietly reshape the heart. When a person repeatedly entertains questions that do not increase obedience, something subtle happens. The heart begins to delay submission. Instead of acting on what is already clear, the person waits for answers to matters that were never meant to be a condition for faith. Over time, this creates a habit of postponement. I will commit fully once I understand everything. But complete understanding was never a requirement set by Allah. Obedience was. Allah has already given us clarity where it matters most. The foundations of belief, the pillars of worship, and the principles of morality are not hidden behind mysteries. They are simple, accessible, and repeated again and again in revelation. When someone ignores these clear commands, but becomes obsessed with abstract questions, they reverse the priorities of faith. They focus on what is distant and neglect what is right in front of them. One of the dangers of unbeneficial questioning is that it feeds the ego. The question is no longer about guidance, but about intellectual dominance. Discussions turn into debates, debates turn into arguments, and arguments turn into pride. The heart becomes more interested in being right than being righteous. And when faith becomes a competition of ideas, rather than a journey of submission, its light begins to dim. There is also a loss of spiritual simplicity. Islam at its core is a path of balance and ease. The Prophet taught faith in a way that was practical, compassionate, and grounded in daily life. When people overload their faith with endless theoretical concerns, they make religion feel heavy and inaccessible, especially for themselves and others. This heaviness does not come from Allah. It comes from taking on burdens He never placed upon us. Another important reality is that some questions are premature. A heart that is weak in worship and discipline is not ready for complex matters. Just as a child is not taught advanced mathematics before learning basic numbers, the soul must be nurtured step by step. When someone rushes into questions beyond their spiritual capacity, it can lead to confusion and doubt rather than clarity. Allah's guidance is gradual, and wisdom lies in respecting that process. Not every question is harmful on its own, but timing and intention matter. A sincere heart that is grounded in prayer, humility, and obedience can approach difficult topics with balance. But a heart that is neglectful, arrogant, or restless will use those same questions as tools for escape. Escape from accountability, escape from commitment, and escape from transformation. Faith flourishes when the heart learns contentment with what Allah has revealed and patience with what He has withheld. This contentment does not kill curiosity. It disciplines it. It teaches the believer that knowledge is a trust, not a trophy. That some answers are delayed, not denied. And that Allah silences, sometimes louder than any explanation. When we internalize that not every question benefits our faith, we become more protective of our hearts. We choose questions that heal rather than harm, that guide rather than distract. We stop measuring faith by how much we can dissect it, and instead measure it by how deeply it changes us. And in doing so, we find that Iman becomes steadier, worship becomes sweeter, and our relationship with Allah becomes more peaceful, rooted not in endless inquiry, but in trust, surrender, and quiet certainty. Curiosity is a powerful gift from Allah, but like every gift, it comes with responsibility. When guided correctly, curiosity leads a person to knowledge, growth, and deeper appreciation of Allah as science. But when left unchecked, it can quietly become a distraction that pulls the heart away from obedience. This is one of the most subtle dangers a believer can face, because it often disguises itself as sincerity, intelligence, or a desire for truth, while slowly weakening commitment to action. There is a type of curiosity that excites the mind but starves the soul. It keeps a person thinking, analyzing, and questioning, yet leaves them stagnant in prayer, inconsistent in worship, and careless in character. The danger here is not ignorance, but imbalance. When curiosity becomes an end in itself, it shifts the focus of faith from living Islam to merely discussing it. The believer becomes more interested in exploring possibilities than fulfilling responsibilities. One of the clear signs of harmful curiosity is when it leads away from obedience. A person may spend hours researching controversial topics, rare opinions, or hypothetical scenarios, yet struggle to wake up for prayer or control their tongue. The heart becomes busy with what if questions while neglecting what must I do responsibilities. This kind of curiosity does not elevate a person. It distracts them from the very purpose of their existence. Allah has made the path to Him clear and practical. He did not ask us to solve mysteries before obeying Him. He asked us to pray, to be just, to show mercy, to avoid sin, and to seek forgiveness when we fall short. When curiosity starts pulling a person away from these basics, it is no longer innocent. It becomes a veil, something that looks like engagement with faith but actually blocks transformation. Another danger is that such curiosity can normalize delay. The heart begins to say, I will commit more once I understand this fully, or I will be more practicing once my doubts are resolved. But obedience was never meant to be conditional upon complete understanding. If that were the case, no one would worship Allah sincerely, because human understanding is always incomplete. This mindset trains the soul to postpone growth indefinitely. Curiosity that leads away from obedience also feeds dissatisfaction. Instead of appreciating what Allah has given, the heart becomes restless about what it does not know. This restlessness can slowly erode gratitude. A person may begin to question divine wisdom, not to seek closeness, but to express discomfort. Over time, this creates emotional distance from Allah, even if outward practice remains. There is also a social danger. And curiosity turns into public speculation, debates, and arguments. It can mislead others. A person may unintentionally spread confusion, especially among those whose faith is fragile. The Prophet was careful about what was discussed publicly, not because truth was feared, but because hearts differ in strength. What benefits one person may harm another. Curiosity without wisdom can therefore become a source of harm rather than guidance. True knowledge in Islam is meant to humble the heart. Harmful curiosity does the opposite. It inflates the ego. The more a person dives into abstract or controversial matters, the more they may feel intellectually superior. This pride is extremely dangerous because it blinds the heart to its own weaknesses. A person may feel advanced in faith while being deficient in sincerity, patience, or compassion. Allah, in His mercy, wants obedience to be accessible to everyone, not only to scholars or philosophers. When curiosity leads people to overcomplicate religion, it creates unnecessary barriers. Faith begins to feel heavy, intimidating, or exclusive. This heaviness pushes people away from consistent worship, which was meant to be a source of comfort and peace. Recognizing this danger does not mean rejecting curiosity altogether. It means disciplining it. It means asking questions that bring you closer to prayer, better character, and stronger trust in Allah. It means stepping back when curiosity starts pulling you away from what is clear and obligatory. Wisdom lies not in asking every possible question, but in knowing which questions serve your akhirah. When curiosity is guided by obedience, it becomes light. When it is detached from obedience, it becomes a burden. The believer who understands this protects their heart carefully, choosing submission over speculation and action over argument. And in that choice, they find that faith becomes simpler, stronger, and far more transformative. Trusting Allah when answers are withheld is one of the highest levels of faith, yet it is also one of the most difficult. The human heart naturally seeks certainty, explanations, and closure. We want to know why things happen the way they do, why some prayers seem unanswered, why hardship touches some lives and not others. But Allah, in His infinite wisdom, does not reveal everything to us, not because He is distant, but because He is caring for our limitations in ways we cannot yet understand. When Allah withholds an answer, He is not withholding His mercy. Often, He is protecting us from knowledge that would overwhelm us, distract us, or harm our hearts. Just as a parent does not explain every complex reality to a child, Allah nurtures us according to our capacity. True trust begins when the believer accepts that Allah's silence is intentional, purposeful, and wise, even when it feels uncomfortable. Many people struggle not with believing in Allah, but with trusting His decisions. They believe He exists, yet they wrestle with His decree. This inner conflict is exhausting. The heart goes back and forth between faith and frustration, between acceptance and resistance. But peace does not come from understanding every decree. It comes from trusting the one who decrees. Once the heart surrenders to this reality, a deep calm begins to settle. Withheld answers often test sincerity. When faith is tied to constant explanations, it becomes conditional. I believe as long as things make sense to me. But true faith says, I believe even when I do not understand. This does not mean abandoning reason. It means recognizing its limits. Reason is a tool, not a ruler. Allah is not subject to human logic. And when we try to force Him into our frameworks, we burden ourselves unnecessarily. Hardship is one of the most common areas where answers are withheld. A person may ask why a loss occurred, why a door closed, Why pain lingered longer than expected. Sometimes years pass before clarity comes. And sometimes it never comes in this world. Trusting Allah in these moments is an act of worship. It is a silent declaration that says, my Lord knows what I do not, and that is enough for me. There is also immense growth hidden in unanswered questions. They teach patience, humility, and reliance. They remind the believer that control is an illusion, and that dependence on Allah is the truest form of strength. When answers are given too easily, the heart may rely on information rather than Allah Himself. But when answers are delayed or withheld, the heart learns to lean fully on Him. One of the most beautiful transformations happens when a believer stops chasing explanations and starts seeking closeness. Instead of asking why, they ask, how can I please Allah in this moment? This shift changes everything. Pain becomes meaningful, waiting becomes purposeful, and uncertainty becomes a space for trust rather than anxiety. Trusting Allah without answers also guards the heart from resentment. When expectations are tied to understanding, disappointment is almost guaranteed. But when expectations are tied to Allah's wisdom, the heart remains soft. Even tears become acts of faith, and struggles become means of drawing nearer to Him. This trust does not remove emotion. Islam does not ask us to be emotionless or unaffected. Even the most beloved servants of Allah felt sorrow, confusion, and grief. But they did not allow those emotions to turn into objection. They felt deeply, yet they remained anchored in trust. That balance is what makes faith mature and resilient. In a world obsessed with explanations, trusting Allah without answers is a quiet rebellion of the soul. It is choosing peace over panic, surrender over struggle, and faith over frustration. And the believer who reaches this level discovers something remarkable. The absence of answers no longer feels like a loss. It feels like being held by a wisdom far greater than one's own. Humility before divine knowledge is the foundation upon which sincere faith is built. It is the quiet recognition that no matter how much we learn, how much we analyze, or how much we think we understand, Allah's knowledge remains infinite, while ours is fragile and limited. This humility is not a weakness. It is a source of strength that keeps the heart grounded, receptive, and protected from arrogance. Without it, knowledge becomes heavy, faith becomes strained, and the soul loses its balance. When a person forgets their limitations, they begin to approach faith as a judge rather than a servant. They weigh revelation against personal opinion, divine commands against preference, and wisdom against comfort. This mindset subtly shifts the role of the believer from one who submits to one who negotiates. Over time, this erodes sincerity because obedience becomes selective rather than complete. Humility corrects this by reminding the heart of its place before the Creator. Allah repeatedly reminds us in Revelation that we have been given only a little knowledge. This reminder is not meant to discourage learning, but to frame it correctly. Knowledge in Islam is meant to lead to awe, not pride. The more a person truly understands, the more they realize how vast and unreachable Allah's wisdom is. This realization softens the heart and nurtures reverence, which is the essence of humility. One of the signs of humility before divine knowledge is comfort with not knowing. The ego hates uncertainty. It wants answers, control, and clarity at all times. But the humble heart is at peace with unanswered questions, not because it lacks curiosity, but because it trusts Allah more than its own reasoning. This trust protects the believer from falling into frustration or doubt when faced with matters beyond human comprehension. Arrogance in knowledge is particularly dangerous because it often goes unnoticed. A person may appear religious, articulate, and informed, yet their heart may be hardened by self-importance. They may look down on others, dismiss simpler forms of worship, or feel spiritually superior. This arrogance blocks growth. Because Allah does not pour wisdom, into a vessel that is already full of itself. Humility, on the other hand, creates space for guidance. Humility also transforms how a believer interacts with others. When someone recognizes their own limitations, they become gentler, more patient, and less judgmental. They understand that guidance is a gift from Allah, not a personal achievement. This perspective fosters compassion rather than condemnation and unity rather than division. It reflects the prophetic character that prioritized mercy over superiority. Another powerful aspect of humility before divine knowledge is how it deepens worship. When a person truly acknowledges Allah's greatness and their own smallness, acts of worship take on new meaning. Prayer becomes an intimate conversation rather than a routine. Recitation of revelation becomes a moment of surrender rather than analysis. Dua becomes sincere because the heart knows it has nowhere else to turn. Humility also protects the believer from despair. When things do not make sense, when efforts seem unrewarded, or when outcomes differ from expectations, a humble heart does not collapse. It accepts that Allah sees the full picture, while it sees only fragments. This acceptance does not eliminate pain, but it prevents bitterness. It allows the believer to remain hopeful, even in uncertainty. In a world that glorifies self-confidence and absolute certainty, humility before divine knowledge is a rare and beautiful quality. It requires courage to admit limitations and strength to surrender control. But those who cultivate this humility find that faith becomes lighter, relationships become kinder, and the heart becomes more at peace. Ultimately, humility before Allah's knowledge is not about lowering one's intellect, but about elevating one's faith. It is standing at the door of divine wisdom, not demanding entry, but waiting patiently, trusting that whatever Allah allows you to know and whatever He keeps from you is exactly what your heart needs for its journey back to Him.